Well, we're talking today about the Circle of Atonement. The Circle of Atonement is not only a truly masterful section of the text, but as you've probably guessed, and as Robert mentioned in the introduction, it's also the section from which our organization gets its name. And I've mentioned before that it's not easy to say that you're affiliated with an organization called the Circle of Atonement. People tend to look at you a little sideways because it sounds too religious or too threatening to be normal. And so what we tend to do in response, or at least what I've tended to do for years, is to pull away from the name, to mention it as little as possible. And no surprise, that has the knock-on effect of pulling us away from the idea behind the name. And so as we've been planning our 30th anniversary next month, I've been thinking a lot about how the Circle of Atonement is actually a really important teaching in the course. It's something that as students of this path, we should know. But particularly as members of a community called the Circle of Atonement, we should really familiarize ourselves with this teaching and ideally return to it at least once a year, kind of like how we return to the message of Easter every year. As Robert was saying in his introduction, the Circle of Atonement can be the basis for a whole new approach to life, one that is incredibly mature, one that is radically inclusive, and one that is unconditionally loving. But we can't fully embody the traits of the Circle of Atonement unless we first understand what they are and why they're there. So given that it's our 30th anniversary, it seems like this is a good time for those of you who are new to get an introduction to what the Circle of Atonement is in the course. And it's also a good reminder for those of us who have been here for a while. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through the elements of the Circle of Atonement section in the course by walking you through what we call around here the Circle of Atonement painting. And then I'm going to tie it all together at the end. And Robert's going to put the painting up so that you can all see it. Oftentimes you'll see it right behind him in the background there. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Circle of Atonement painting, this is an original painting that I gave to Robert the very first time that we met in person in 2017. I commissioned it from a very old friend of mine as an updated version of the Circle of Atonement logo that Robert drew in the early 90s when the organization was founded. And one of the things that I love about this painting is that it's not only a beautiful piece of art, but it functions as a diagram because it's a visual representation of the Circle of Atonement teaching in the course. And so that's how I'm going to go through it today. I'm going to go from the outer to the inner and then the outer again. And then along the way, you'll see that really beautiful vision here that we can all incorporate into our own lives. And so I won't keep the painting up the whole time, but I want to start with it so you really understand what we're looking at here. The process begins with us feeling very estranged from God and from each other. So the main idea is that we're estranged from God because the whole idea of the Circle of Atonement is that within it, you're reconciled with God. That's what atonement means. But we're obviously not as in touch with that idea as we are with how estranged we are from each other. And so that's what you see with the people who look like they're floating in space. They are what the section calls the tortured minds, who believe themselves to be outside and left to suffer guilt alone. And I say they, but we all know how that feels. We all feel homeless here. We all feel like a fish out of water here. We all feel like aliens, the Course says. And so in that sense, we're all the floaty people. But of course, no one is actually left outside. The Circle of Atonement section directly states that none are excluded, and it references, quote, those who think they are outside. And so in the end, we only think that we can be cut off. In God's mind, on the level of ultimate reality, everything is undisturbed. All is as he created it. But in our mind, on the level of what we experience here, we don't know that. We think that we've been left outside to suffer guilt alone, to be in the cold, and that we do know. So I'm guessing that you don't need me to remind you of how cold it is out there. You can go ahead and take the painting off the screen, Robert. No one escapes feeling hurt and attacked by other people here. And of course, we do the same thing to other people here. But this is where the Circle of Atonement comes in, because the Circle of Atonement is the exact opposite of being alienated and alone. So the circle is a symbol. It's not an actual place, but it's a symbol for the idea that we are fully joined with God, that we are fully joined with each other, and that we are free of suffering of every kind. And so the Circle of Atonement is the idea of perfect peace and harmony and joy among all things. And even as I say that, I'm sure you can feel that we all have a deep need for this. And as Robert was saying before, this is why basically every religion promises that at the end of our journey, we will either arrive or will have the potential to arrive in a state of pure peace and pure bliss. There's a lot of names for this. We call it heaven, we call it paradise, we call it nirvana, and so on. But at the center of these ideas is that concept of atonement. And atonement is one of those words that we just struggle with. It's a simple idea to grasp. Again, atonement just means we're reconciled with God. We're back in harmony with him. But part of why we struggle with that word is because it comes with a lot of really heavy Christian baggage. So in Christianity, we are reconciled with God because Jesus's death paid for our sins, which means that at the end of the day, we're all guilty sinners. There's something corrupt, something evil in us that makes us unqualified to be in God's presence. And only when that guilt and sin are gone can we be back in harmony with him. And in the Course, atonement is still this idea of reunification with God, but not because Jesus was sacrificed. As the Course says, love doesn't kill to save. I love that line. In the Course, atonement means everything we think separated us from God isn't real. So in other words, no matter what we do, there is no error that rises to the level of sin. And so it's not that you're guilty and Jesus came to die for that. It's that you're guiltless and Jesus came to teach you that. So in the Course, the defining characteristic of the Circle of Atonement, and in fact, the central message of what it calls the curriculum we're here to learn is, as Carla mentioned in her beautiful prayer, guiltlessness. The very first line of the Circle of Atonement section is the message given to each to share is always the same. God's Son is guiltless. And that exact line God's Son is guiltless is so important that the Course uses it 5 times. The Course calls it, again, the message given everyone to share, the lesson that is the basis of the real world, the central theme of the universal curriculum, and the only judgment there is. So there you go. The Circle of Atonement is the symbol for the place in our collective consciousness where no one is estranged. No one is estranged from God. No one is estranged from each other. There is only complete harmony and joining because there is no guilt. So this is what our minds would be without the destructive influence of the ego. No grievances, no attacks, no blame or judgment. And without those things, all that's left is joy and peace and love. And this is how it could be for us if we could look out into the world at everyone and everything from this central place of God's Son is guiltless. Meaning, as God's Son, as an extension of Him, everyone is created eternally pure. We can't corrupt the identity He gave us. And so everybody is in the circle forever. And this is where the Course tends to divert from other paths, especially more traditionally religious paths. So it is not that only certain people get into the circle or that we could do something to have our membership revoked. Everybody is in, and everybody is in forever. So one way to get our minds around this idea is that if you think of God as the purest, most unconditional love that you can imagine and stretch that to infinity, then you can think about the Circle of Atonement as this exact same idea applied to family. So you take the most generous and kind and loving family that you can imagine, and you stretch that to infinity. You stretch that to include absolutely everyone. It still wouldn't come close to what the circle really is, but that concept of unconditionally loving family at least gets us on the right track. And I also like this concept of family stretched to infinity, because oftentimes we love our family in ways that can get us in touch with how we're supposed to love in the Course. So if you have kids, you know that they screw up all the time and you still love them anyway, because they're your kids. And so you let them slide on behaviors that you would absolutely demonize other people for. But because your kid did it, you hold it lighter than you would if somebody else had. And that's the big idea of this section. We all want to be in the circle versus floating around in the cold. We all want that feeling of coming in from the dark. We all want that feeling of being home, being surrounded by love, and being surrounded by our family. And if we see other people as guilty, then we kick them out of the house into the cold, and we send them the message that they're guilty and they don't belong. But if we see other people as guiltless, if we see them in their true nature, then we invite them into the circle, and that's what we're here to do. In fact, the section says, this is our calling. It says your only calling here is to devote yourself with active willingness to the denial of guilt in all its forms. And that's a huge statement. Our only calling is to devote ourselves to the denial of guilt in others. We don't think of our lives this way, but from a Course perspective, this is what we're here to teach, because this is what we're here to learn. The section says that we each have our own special part, but the message we are given to teach is always God's Son is guiltless. meaning our whole calling is to get this one message out into the world. That's what we're meant to be doing every time we speak and with everything that we do. And think about how different that is from how we tend to view going through our days, how we tend to view what it is that we do in the world and why it is that we're here. If you think that you can't do that, if you think that this world is just too cold to treat other people as if they're guiltless, if you think that people are just too cruel, the Course doesn't let us get away with that, because this is where Jesus comes in. And if you remember in the painting, that white figure in the middle, that's Jesus. He was able to do what the Course is asking us to do, to see everyone in light of their true nature. And because he achieved that state in a body, he proved to all of us that it could be done. So in the section, in the Circle of Atonement section, Jesus portrays himself as standing in the circle and being that teacher of guiltlessness that we're meant to be, calling us to join him there. And this is, again, why Jesus appears in the center of the Circle of Atonement painting. So we're meant to take Jesus as our model. We're meant to teach peace with him. And paragraph 7 and 8 of the Circle of Atonement section say some really important things about his role. And so I want to read those to you in their entirety. And as I do, I really want to invite you to take in what the Course is saying and imagine that he's saying this to you personally. This is one of the few occasions in the Course where Jesus speaks of himself in first person. So I'm going to read you paragraph 7 and 8. You're welcome to close your eyes if you like, but whether you do or whether you don't, again, imagine that he's saying this to you directly. Peace, then, be unto everyone who becomes a teacher of peace. For peace is the acknowledgement of perfect purity, from which none are excluded. Within its holy circle is everyone whom God created as his son. Joy is its unifying attribute, and no one left outside to suffer guilt alone. The power of God draws everyone to its safe embrace of love and union. Stand quietly within this circle and attract all who believe themselves to be outside to join you there. It is given you to call all tortured minds to join you in the safety of its peace and holiness. Abide with me within it as a teacher of atonement, not of guilt. Blessed are ye who teach with me. Our power comes not of us, but of our Father. In guiltlessness, we know him as he knows us guiltless. I stand within the circle, calling you to peace. Teach peace with me and stand with me on holy ground. Remember for everyone your Father's power, which he has given him. Believe not that you cannot teach his perfect peace. Stand not outside, but join with me within. Fail not the only purpose to which my teaching calls you. Restore to God his Son as he created him by teaching him his innocence. So you can open your eyes when you're ready. Beautiful paragraphs. And here we have the culmination of all that we've covered so far. The acknowledgement of perfect purity. No one is excluded. No one's left outside. In guiltlessness, we know God. We're called to be a teacher of peace, quietly standing within the circle and attracting those who believe they're outside to join you there. And I love that idea of quietly standing in the circle and calling, attracting other people to join you there, because it's so different than what we typically think of when we think of getting out there for Jesus. So you really get the sense from these paragraphs that teaching innocence is our only purpose here. And again, if Jesus could do this while being betrayed and murdered in the most gruesome way, then we can do it with our same comparatively minor things that we face in our life. And this is not only how other people recognize that they're in the circle, but this is how we recognize that we're in it too. And so that's the next step. And this is where you really see the brilliance of the course start to come through. Because forgiveness is clearly the healing and repair that is needed in this world, but it's also the very healing that we need too. Because this world wouldn't be the way that it is if deep down we believe that other people are guiltless. And so deep down, we don't believe that they're guiltless. Uh-oh. Okay. Because deep down, we don't believe that other people are guiltless. And because we don't believe they're guiltless, we don't believe that we are either. And so as we go through this cycle of bringing people into the circle and kicking them out and bringing them in and kicking them out, then how can we keep doing that without believing that one day we're going to get kicked out too? So somewhere we let it in that if they do something that means that they can get kicked out, that they don't deserve to be here, then so can we. So our ability to be in the circle is tied to theirs. If we toss them out of in the cold today, then what's to say that we aren't out there floating with them tomorrow? The section says, if you bring him into the circle of purity with you, you will rest there with him. If you leave him without, you join him there. So you put someone else out of the circle in with the floaty people, and you're floating right there with him. You kick him out, you're there with him. And so to be in the circle yourself, you have to bring everyone with you. And everyone means everyone. In the Course, we do not get to God alone. We are like that old movie, The Defiant Ones, where Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier are prisoners who are chained together. We go home together in the Course, or we don't go home at all. And so I want to tell you a little story about this idea. And I'm always tempted to find some big show-stopping example of forgiveness that sort of presents this impossible idea as something that we can do. You know, the mother who forgives the person who murdered her child or something like that. But lately, I've noticed that I'm finding myself really inspired by these tiny little acts of grace. Robert thinks this one's almost too tiny to share, but I think it's really sweet. And I hope it sticks with you the way that it has stuck with me. So a few months ago, my kids were visiting, and Robert and I took them to the Isle of Wight. And it's a whole deal. If you're familiar with England, it's a whole big deal to get to the Isle of Wight. It's an island. And so you have to drive onto a ferry, and the ferry takes you and your car across, and then you drive off. And so on this day, my job was to be the navigator. Robert was driving, and I was reading the directions on my phone. And I got us there fine. But on the way back, I, for some reason, punched in car ferry, and the navigation took us to the wrong end of the island. So evidently there was more than one. And so we were supposed to be in Yarmouth, but we ended up in Ryde. So clearly we were going to miss the ferry that we had tickets for because we were on the opposite end of the island. And it was super stressful. I was stressed, Robert was stressed, kids were stressed. And in these situations, our first instinct, we almost can't help it, is to look for the person to blame. And in this case, that was me. And I got a pile of it from the kids, which only made me feel more guilty and more defensive. And this mood just set in the car. And Robert handled it really differently. He was like, it's okay. It's going to be an adventure. It's all good. Nobody's hurt. And the reason why I'm sharing this story with you in particular is because I was able to see in real time the effect that criticizing and blaming has on someone, which tapped into what I was already doing to myself. And so it made the situation worse compared to a loving response that kind of made the pain go away. So in one moment, I felt what it was like to be floating in the cold. And I also felt what it was like to be standing next to the fire. And what's interesting is that I saw the effect that this had on Robert, who really wanted to make me feel okay. And he got the benefit of actually doing that. He was able to make me feel okay. And then he got to feel good about his response in the situation. And I also saw the effect that it had on the kids. And this is really interesting, particularly Christian, because he was the most annoyed. Christian is my oldest son, he's 16. And so blaming me gave him an outlet for his frustration. But I also saw it made him feel bad about himself at the same time, especially compared to how Robert responded. So Christian kicked me out of the circle, but he lost because in doing that, he saw that it hurt me. And in the process, it hurt him. So it's a really, really small example. It's super tiny, but these are the kinds of things that happen every day. Every day, we're given these little opportunities to say to somebody, it's okay, I forgive you. And if we don't get it right with the little things, then how can we ever expect to get it right with the big ones? So if we don't get this right, then we failed to learn the very lesson that the course says that we're here to learn. So this is a big deal. It is easy to reject people. It is easy to judge and to blame people and to hate people and to kick them out of the circle. That's why everybody does it. It is harder to be a teacher of peace. But that is the work. That is why we're here. And you'll know that you're making progress when there is this kindness that's radiating from you, that you can feel and that other people can feel. You'll know that you're making progress when you can be gentle, even when other people are disagreeing with you or even criticizing you. You know that you're making progress when you're being loving, even when things aren't working out the way that you want. You know that you're making progress when you're in a stressful situation, but you resist that temptation to blame or polarize. And you definitely know that you're making progress when you're capable of seeing what you've done wrong, to admit when you've done something wrong, and through it all, to teach that innocence that Jesus is talking about in this section. There's a quote that's attributed to Cory Booker that I love. He says, before you speak to me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people. Before you tell me how much you love your God, show me in how much you love all of his children. Before you preach to me of your passion for your faith, teach me about it through your compassion for your neighbors. Because in the end, I am not as interested in what you have to tell or sell as I am in how you choose to live and give. And I think that says it. It's kind of liberating to think that our only job here is to join Jesus inside the circle and become a teacher of peace through our gentleness and our love. You know, we can see that as a chore. We can see it as impossible. or we can see it as a privilege to be part of a vision that is as beautiful and as healing as the circle is described. We're not going to be at the level that Jesus is just yet. Of course, says that we'll get there eventually. Who knows when? But this is how we do it. This is how we climb the spiritual mountaintop from a Course perspective. And the section says something really cool. It says the power of God himself supports this teaching and guarantees its limitless results. It says, join your own efforts to the power that cannot fail and must result in peace. And I love this line. No one can be untouched by teaching such as this. That is the beauty of this idea. When we're teaching innocence, no one can be untouched. And we don't need the Course to tell us that's true. We all just melt and we're all just blown away when someone responds to an attack with love. But beyond that, again, the section says that we have the power of God himself supporting us and guaranteeing our results. So all that stuff about like, I can't do this, I'm going to get run over. Or if I teach innocence, then what does that mean? Doesn't it just let the other person get away with their abusive behavior? That kind of thing. We need to think our job is to be teachers of peace and trust that we have the power of God guaranteeing our results. Whole different way to live. And in fact, at some point, I want to go deeper into this idea that there is a real spiritual power in these messages. And I don't just mean the power to be good people, although that's certainly part of it. The Course says we have the actual power of God supporting our efforts to deny guilt in all forms and guaranteeing its results. Incredible concept. But in the meantime, though, I just want to close by coming back to where we started, which is here in the small c circle of atonement and how we're embodying this idea. Because now, hopefully, the whole picture is becoming clearer. And Robert, if you could put the painting back on the screen. So again, it starts with that feeling of being homeless, being estranged here, feeling guilty, feeling cut off from God, cut off from each other. But we can enter the circle of atonement. We can enter the circle by teaching peace, teaching innocence with Jesus, and devoting ourselves to this role. And then by doing this, we call to those who think they're outside, the floaty people, telling them that they're guiltless and asking them to come in, attracting them in. And with each person that we draw in, each mind that we draw in, we become more convinced that we ourselves are in. This is the way that God himself chose for us to come home. And because of that, it's guaranteed to work because we have the power of God supporting it. So incredible. So you can take it off the screen now. Are we standing for this? Are we standing for this? I know that my job as the pastor equivalent here is to leave you with some inspiring close, but the truth is, I don't think we are. I think there's still so much work to be done to be the people this section is calling us to be. We can get there at some point. Obviously, the Course says we will get there, but we can speed up our journey by making a real dedication amongst ourselves to be a community that is devoted to these ideas, not just when times are good, but when they aren't. That's the thing that is going to guarantee that the circle is around for another 30 years and beyond. That's the thing that is going to push the Course out into the world in a truly meaningful way. And that's the thing that's going to ensure our own spiritual development. By devoting ourselves with active willingness to our only calling here. I mentioned before, and Robert said this as well, that this can be the basis for an entirely new approach to our lives, a new vision for our lives. It can change how we see ourselves, how we see our relationship with God, how we see our relationships with each other. It can change how we see our function and our purpose here. It can change how we see the course, how we see our progression on the spiritual path. And it all boils down to one question. Do you want to be a teacher of peace, or do you want to be a teacher of guilt? And I think you know which you're supposed to choose. Thank you. Uh-oh.